and narrow, and on the
Good
other
evening,
hand,
Earth, and
they may
happy
be profound
Valentine's Day,
and very
all.
wide, and
This is
I
Adam
think
Sturch
certainly
broadcasting from the
greatest
Mushroom
works of
Mansion
art
House, New
are
Mexico,
those created
working
by
on
those
oil painting
men and women
Medusa's crown.
whose experience
Okay, just continuing with the spiraling faces. See if I can get the rest of the surface area, negative space laid in with that pattern, with the same color of blue that I already have mixed up. So here we go. Oh yes. And so I don't space it out when I finish this session. It looks like the weather is going to be decent tomorrow. So I'm going to open garage art from probably 11:30 noonish to whenever it starts getting cool again, around 4. So at least for a little while, set things up, put out the signs, and I'm promoting a sale. I have a pretty large selection of 24 by 30 inch canvases, oil paintings, as well as 18 by 24s and various other sizes, all on sale between 50 and 100 bucks. So if you need some weird art, come to Garage Art. So here we go.
Subjects he was writing about. And in a very different, more classical tone, we find Matthew Arnold saying the same thing in The Strayed Reveller, where the Strayed Reveller speaks about the gods and the poets, that they both see the world with this God's eye view of humanity at large, but whereas the gods do not identify with the world's suffering, the poet does, and the Strayed Reveller concludes, "At such a price the gods exact a song to become what we sing." Now, the function of the artist is to become what he sings, and then to express by means of extremely penetrating and powerful symbols what he has experienced. Needless to say, all experience is ultimately ineffable. We have, of course, concepts for everything, but they are finally quite inadequate to the experience itself, which is not only mystical experience, but even the most ordinary sensory experience is really ineffable. We have these conventional words in which to describe it. And the essence of all poetry, of course, is in some way to make the ineffable effable by, instead of trying to express the indescribable in rational terms, the poet goes about it in a circular way, and so to speak encloses this void of ineffability with a network of symbols whose arrangement is such that, so to say, they take on their quality from the white spaces between the lines, from the emptiness within the network. They in some way do create a kind of equivalent of on a symbolic level of the experience which they express. And this is a really mysterious thing. It's extremely difficult to understand how it is that art at its highest can somehow bypass the essential ineffability of experience and create a kind of experiential equivalent in terms of symbols. Nevertheless, however difficult and mysterious this process is, this is precisely what happens, I think, when a work of art on a great scale is created. That we do somehow make this equivalent of experience in terms of symbols. Well, now let us consider briefly the relation, the importance of art in relation to ordinary life and society. Why art here? Well, I think one of the reasons of why art is that art is certainly one of the elements which helps to give a style to life. May either give a good style or a bad style. And good artists, I think, really are benefactors of society, in as much as they help to improve the general style of living. It was just Oscar Wilde remarked very truly that art doesn't so much imitate nature as nature imitates art. This happens again, and we see this happening again and again in the history of societies, that people do take on in their practical living the qualities suggested to them by their works of art. And in this sense, the aesthetic shortcomings may be regarded almost as moral delinquencies. There is a certain justice in the praise which the crowd cries out in Julius Caesar, tear him for his bad verses. They haven't got the right reason there, but there probably are quite good reasons for tearing people for their bad verses. Because they do, by producing bad works of art, lower the general style of living. I think it would be quite untrue to say that the work of art is the only factor determining the general style of living within a society, but it is undoubtedly one of the factors, and as such it has, I think, a great social importance. And now, briefly, I would like to make a digression on another of the functions of art, which is the cathartic function, the therapeutic function. Art, it seems to me, has two functions. One is communicative, where a person of great talent communicates through his power to create expressive symbols, communicates insights which his special talents permit him to have. He communicates qualities within this experience of his, which his powers of sensitivity and sympathy allow him to have within himself and to give out.
Too late for playtime, Bobo.
This is one of the functions. And the other function is a cathartic and therapeutic function. And many of the great artists have, of course, have often spoken of this cathartic function of art. And they have spoken of the way in which the artistic expression does permit the release of tension within the artist himself, and the getting rid of all kinds of painful emotions. And this is the second function of art. Now, I would say that practically everybody would be well advised to practice art for its therapeutic values. The sort of do-it-yourself painters, the Sunday painters, the ceramic workers and so on, they are undoubtedly doing something which is extremely good for themselves. They are getting rid of all kinds of internal troubles in this way. But I think the point which has to be stressed is this, which I think one has to emphasize to all Sunday painters, that although my painting a picture may do me a lot of good, your looking at my picture may not do you any good. In fact, it may give you a severe pain and make you feel rather seasick. And for this reason, I think one should always advise the Sunday painter to confine himself to therapy and not to exhibit. Leave the exhibition of paintings to those who can communicate and who have something to communicate. Unhappily, the world is so unjustly arranged that there are relatively few people who have very much to communicate, and above all, who have this very strange talent for using symbols in such a way that communication can take place. And now, let's consider some of the forms of art. And here, I think it's worth drawing an analogy between the arts and the sciences. In the history of science, we see two methods of thinking about the world, two types of methodology. There is the atomistic method, first of all, the method of analyzing things down into their constituent parts and elements. And this is represented in classical antiquity by Democritus, and then we see it revived in the period of modern science of Galileo and Newton, and in modern days by contemporary physicists and chemists. This is the analytical method, which of course has been immensely fruitful. But there is also another way of looking at the world, which is the method of seeing not the component elements, but the general forms or gestalts within nature. And this is represented in antiquity by such thinkers as Plato and Aristotle, and in modern times by the comparative anatomists, by the morphologists. Incidentally, the word was invented by Freud, by Goethe, and the morphologist, and by the students of growth, by Gestalt psychologists, and so on. And this is a legitimate, and we discover, an extremely fruitful way of looking at the world. Now, in general, it may be said that art has pursued the second method more than the first. It has been generally a search for forms within the natural world and an imposition of forms to make the explanation and the comprehension of the world more clear. We have, as I say, not only looked for forms, but we have also in art imposed forms upon our experience. But there has, I think it's true to say, there has also been a considerable experiment, particularly in modern times, with what may be called atomistic art. In the world of the novel, for example, we see atomistic novels represented by such works as Lawrence's Women in Love, the novels of Dorothy Richardson, of James Joyce. All these are, so to say, atomistic narratives carried on rather like in the world of physics, atomic physics, which considers reality below the level of qualities. And so these atomistic novels consider human beings, so to say, below the level of character. And in the same way, we find in contemporary music such composers as Boulez, who are writing music which, so to say, is below the level of melody. And in painting we see phenomena like such as Jackson Pollock, who is painting below the level of geometry, very much as the atomic physicist works on nature below the level of qualities. And in general, however, I think the art has more often pursued forms, the gestalts within nature, and as I say, has tried to impose its own system of forms upon the world. Well, of course, there are quite clearly two types of art. The type of art, pictorial and plastic arts, which deal with space, and then there are the other arts whose fundamental medium is time, the art of music, poetry, drama, narration. These are temporal arts, and the others are spatial arts. And within the spatial arts, of course, the fundamental forms, the fundamental types of arrangement have to do with symmetry and asymmetry. And it's interesting here to look at the way in which I think it's true to say that the arts which deal with space have borrowed a number of their significant symbols from the world of nature. For example, if we look at the world of nature, we find that everything that we regard as living and dynamic, I mean the typical animal, from the insect up to the mammal, is bilaterally symmetrical, but asymmetrical fore and up. In other words, it has a head and a tail, and its legs on each side are much the same. And this sort of one-pointed symbol, this arrow-like shape, is, I think one will find in all pictorial forms that this is a very powerful, dynamic symbol. Whereas the circular symmetry, radial symmetry, is found only in plants and in sessile or free-floating forms. It is not found in forms of animal life which move of their own volition. It is found, as I say, only in those which are attached to the earth or which float about in water, or also in plants which do not move in the same way as animals move. And I think this fact, this profound obvious natural fact, is perhaps what accounts for the feeling that we have about the curved form and the pointed form. I mean, we certainly get, if we look at Romanesque architecture with its rounded arches, a sense of repose and the domes and so on. And from the Gothic architecture, which is with its one-pointed drive upwards, this sense of dynamic power. And I think one could probably, with a little ingenuity, find many other examples of symbols which have been taken from natural objects and incorporated into the symbol vocabulary which artists have used. But then within the temporal arts, we find also a certain taking over of the natural forms of rhythm within the world. I mean, we are perfectly familiar, of course, with these temporal natural rhythms, the astronomical rhythms, night and day, the circles of the moon, the coming and going of the seasons, the cycles of vegetation, and so on. And it's interesting to note, too, that man has found it necessary to add to these natural divisions of what Whitehead called perpetual perishing of the continual flux of time. He's found it necessary to supplement these natural divisions with artificial divisions of his own. He has imposed the week upon the month. He has imposed church holidays, national holidays, and so on. Anything in which to break up the rather terrifying fact of this continual flux of time, to make it seem in some way space-like, and to give it this, even in the process of living it, to give it a certain artistic form. Well, I think it's clear that analogues of these natural forms of time divisions have been taken over in the various temporal arts. I mean, we see the various types of rhythm within music, the curves, broken curves, or curves of circles of repetition going on within both music and poetry and the drama and narration. And there have been, I would say, quite definitely borrowings of the fundamental forms out of nature into art. We see this curious and interesting fact that we impose our symbols upon nature, but borrow the shape of them in many cases from nature. We take something, turn it into a symbol, and give it back to nature. And a problem, of course, arises here in relation to certain types of advanced modern art. For example, I've mentioned the musical boulez just now, and one wonders very much whether a music which has so completely transcended and got beyond the ordinary natural rhythms, the rhythms of the heartbeat, the rhythms of respiration and so on, whether such a music, however interesting it may be, can form the basis of a new style, whether we are not compelled by the very nature of our being to conform more than certainly some very advanced forms of modern art do to the natural rhythms within us. I would guess that these experiments, which seem to betray an extraordinary kind of impatience, as though it were impossible to spend so much time as is required in listening to a music in which the natural rhythms occur. Whether such a music so telescoped and so short, reduced to a kind of shorthand, can form the basis of a flowering and developing musical style. I don't know. I have a strong feeling that it will be found to be almost impossible to keep this going as the basis of a new music. But of course I may be entirely wrong. Now, let us now pass. I'm afraid this lecture is rather incoherent because I have to talk about such an immense number of things. But I would like to talk very briefly about the creative act. What does the artist do when he prepares himself to make a work of art? Well, I think in the general terms...
Alright, so that gets the second row around
concentrate his mind upon
the left side, moving over to the right. I think I'm going to do another session. Let's get one more row out this evening. So I'm going to take a break and then come back and do that. Take two coming up.
Such an immensely much greater number of these important aspects of human experience, both aesthetic and emotional, intellectual and spiritual, that I would without any hesitation think that these works, however perfect they may be, are essentially minor works of art, and that the great perfections require a more comprehensive taking in of experience. And incidentally, I think there's a great deal to be said for the fact that if you do have elaborate compositions illustrating, for example, a scene in the Bible or in Greek mythology, you have opportunities of creating purely aesthetic values much greater than if you are confining yourself to purely non-objective elements. For example, I mean, take a picture which I happen to like very much, a picture by Botticelli called the Calumny of a Penny. It's a very, very odd picture indeed. One generally, if one looks at it, one doesn't know what on earth it's about. I actually took the trouble once to look it up in one of the dialogues of Lucian, where the subject matter of this picture is described. And I found this picture of Botticelli's is, among other things, an extremely good and accurate illustration of this story out of Lucian? Well, the story is not of great importance, but it is very important aesthetically, inasmuch as the necessity of painting a great many figures, one of whom is naked, the other clothed, within an architectural background, called upon, made it necessary for Botticelli to organize the purely aesthetic and formal and coloristic elements in his picture. It made it necessary for him to bring in an immense number of these elements and to organize them into an incredibly complicated composition, which I don't think any merely non-representational composition, however elaborate, could ever have approached. I mean, I don't think the human mind is so constructed that it can produce anything quite as complex aesthetically or quite as satisfactory as the representation of a complex scene in the outside world. Now, very briefly, let's talk about different kinds of art. Obviously, what we have learned in recent times is to tolerate it and to like very many different kinds of art. 200 years ago, everything was extremely simple because there was only one kind of art which any civilized person in the Western world could admit to be art, and that was Greco-Roman Renaissance art and its successors. Well, now everything else, of course, was condemned and thought to be ridiculous, and that all other forms of art were regarded as merely as inept efforts to realize the kind of perfection created by the Greco-Roman and Renaissance artists. Well, now we have an immensely much greater knowledge than our parents had. We have photography which has placed at our disposal reproductions of every kind of work of art. Even in my own lifetime, it's incredible what has been opened up. When I was a boy, there was no such thing as Sumerian art or as Minoan art. These things were quite unknown. Mayan art was virtually unknown. Very little was known about the Incas. Nothing virtually was known about the Africans or the Polynesians. Now all this has entered into our knowledge, into our sphere of understanding, and we realize quite clearly that all these methods of looking at the world are perfectly legitimate, and that there are means of achieving perfection within each of these methods. And I think this is, in one sense, an immense gain for us. In another sense, it poses great difficulties because in the time when there was only one legitimate art, people were not distracted at all from it. I mean, they knew there was only one way of doing a thing, and they threw aside everything else. And consequently, they were able, for example, with the elements of Greco-Roman architecture, to go on exploring the possibilities of the style from the late 15th century to the middle of the 19th. And it's incredible what a lot they got out of it simply by concentrating on this one thing. Today we know such an immense amount that it seems very difficult for any body to concentrate for as long as was done in the past on any single one style. And perhaps this is a kind of disadvantage from which we suffer. We have what the French call embarras de richesse. We are embarrassed by our own wealth. And it may be that in certain respects our more ignorant fathers were better off than we are. But for the rest of us, I think, except for practicing examples, except for practicing artists, I think we are all incomparably better off for this immensely wider range of knowledge which is at our disposal. I would add to the discoveries within my own lifetime. One of the great discoveries, of course, has been the discovery of Paleolithic art. The earliest one, the discoveries were made before I was born, but many of the greatest discoveries have come out within the quite recent years. And we realize that here again, even among these extraordinarily primitive people, there were perfections. I mean, anybody who's seen the cave paintings at Lascaux in south-central France must have been overcome with the extraordinary power of these things. And it also raises the most interesting psychological problems. I mean, when we compare the nature of these extremely naturalistic paintings, which seem to have been based upon a capacity for eidetic imagery, when we compare these with the completely conceptualized paintings of Neolithic times, which in their own way are also extremely perfect, we realize what an immense spectrum the world of art can cover. I mean, it can cover, as I say, at one end the art based upon eidetic imagery, perhaps created by people with whom language hadn't been much developed yet. I mean, perhaps this was why they were able to think in such non-conceptual terms. The other end of the scale, we find the Neolithic art, which is so completely conceptualized that it looks as though man was suddenly reveling in the discovery of language and were projecting onto his painted surfaces these wonderful new verbal ideas which he was able to use which have given new sense to the world. And it does show very clearly over what an enormous gamut this extraordinary activity of art can spread. Now, we finally come to the most difficult problem of all, the problem of music. Well, why on earth does music affect us as it does? This is a very mysterious thing because unlike the literary or plastic and pictorial arts, the symbols, the sound symbols of music, they do not represent anything in the external world. They do not have a conventional meaning such as words have. They are not onomatopoeic, they don't correspond at all closely. I mean, the general rhythms may be analogous to the natural rhythms, but there is nothing which makes music strictly comparable to literature or to the pictorial and plastic arts. Nevertheless, I don't think anybody can doubt that music has a profound meaning, but what that meaning is very difficult to say. It certainly isn't the meaning which is on the program notes. To start with, every program annotator says something different. I mean, says this work was made by Beethoven's heart was breaking for somebody or other. The next one says that this is a work of overpowering gaiety or something of the kind. And but nevertheless, this meaning is there and is of profound importance. It is worthwhile in this context to listen to what great musicians have thought about what they were doing. What did Beethoven, for example, think that music was about? Beethoven's writing is unsatisfactory. I mean, his power of expression was entirely within the realm of music. His letters, on the whole, I think, are rather disappointing as letters. And when he wanted to express it himself, he just had to write music. consequently, what he has to say about music is, in a sense, rather banal, and yet I think it has very great importance. Like many other composers, he seems to think that music has a cognitive aspect, that through music, that it was possible for man to come to a special kind of knowledge of the universe, something like the mystics' obscure knowledge, knowledge of the totality of being. And what he says is this: music is the sole incorporeal entrance into the higher scale of knowledge which comprehends mankind. It gives prophetic vision and heavenly wisdom. Well, this, of course, these are, as I say, rather banal and not very significant phrases, but I do think this whole idea of the cognitive value of music, and indeed of all art, is probably very important, that in a certain sense, art, as I say, is something which imposes forms upon the flux of reality, gives it meaning. But in a certain sense it is also discovering not merely forms, but discovering that which, so to say, lies behind the forms. That there is a sense, I think, in which, and this after all is profoundly important in the ideas of Plato, that in beauty we do discover something about the nature of the world, that this in some way or other, entirely ineffable and inexplicable way, beauty is built into the fundamental nature of things, and that art is a method of discovering this. And music, above all, with its strange capacity for discovering a sort of pure, incorporeal, dynamic essence of life, does perhaps provide the most powerful weapon for exploring this, the one aspect at least of the ultimate nature of the world. And I would like to finish with this idea, which is, I'm afraid, extremely vague, because I don't understand it myself. But I do feel very strongly that this Beethoven's idea of the cognitive value of music, and indeed of art in general, is a real thing, and that, as I say, that we do not merely impose forms upon the world, we discover them within the world, and we also discover that which lies beyond form, and that which is the ultimate source of all form, which, as so to say, the creative principle at the upstream from all particular manifestations. Well, I'll reserve my thanks to the end, and I think I better start directly with this large and complicated subject of human potentialities. Let us begin by asking a question. What would have happened what would have happened to a child of 170 IQ born into a Paleolithic family at the time of, say, the cave paintings of Lascaux? Well, quite obviously, I mean, even if he was as intelligent as Professor Wiener, he could have hardly have developed cybernetics at that period. He could have been nothing except a hunter and a food gatherer. There was no other opportunity for him to be anything else. And now the interesting fact is, of course, that the biologists have shown us that physiologically, anatomically, we are very much the same as we were 20,000 years ago, and that we are using fundamentally the same equipment as the Aurignacian man to produce incredibly different results. That we have, in the course of these 20,000 years, actualized an immense number of things which at that time, and for many, many centuries thereafter, were wholly potential and latent in man. And this, I think, gives us reason for tempered optimism in regard to the future. I think there are still a great many potentialities of a desirable kind, of course also of an undesirable kind, but I think there are still great potentialities for rationality, for affection and kindliness, for creativity, are still lying latent in man. And it may be, since everything has speeded up so enormously in recent years, it may be that we shall find methods for going almost as far beyond the point where we have reached now. We may find methods for going beyond it within a few hundred years, to go beyond it as far as we have succeeded in going beyond our Aurignacian ancestors in 20,000 years. I think this is not an entirely fantastic belief. The neurologists assured us that no human being has ever made use of more than perhaps as much as 10% of all the neurons in his brain. And perhaps, if we set about it in the right way, we may be able to produce extraordinary things out of this strange piece of work that a man is. Well, there are, of course, geneticists who talk about the possibilities of eugenics, and quite clearly it would be possible to breed a more efficient type of man. But I think this is so far out of any question of practical politics at the moment that it's not worth discussing. And also, at present, we really don't know what to breed for. The most that we can say is that there are certain undesirable things which we would like to breed against, but when it comes to the positive side, we don't, I think, know enough to be practical geneticists yet. So I won't talk about that at all, but consider what can be done with the kind of human beings that we are at present. Now, I would think that one of the most important things we have to think about in relation to human beings and to the possibility of actualizing more of our desirable potentialities, one of the important points which we should stress, I feel, more than we do now, is the fact of human differences. Now, human differences are in their way just as important as human similarities. Human beings are unique. The species is more variable than any other species. And every type of human being, every individual who can be, of course, he can be categorized as continuous in a system of continuous variables within a three-pole system. Every individual has a right to his own place in the system and a right to develop according to his own constitution and temperament.
Okay, still a few minutes left. I'm on the panic there. I thought I might have gone over time. We still got 7 minutes.
So
zoom in a little bit.
In getting the best,
at least for this layer, I think I'm going to call it done. And mix up another batch of paint for the next layer. Get it as close as possible. But it's not going to matter too much because it's all going to be glazed, highlight, and shadowed before it's over with. But I really do like that tone so far.
Particular place in the general scheme of human beings. Now, of course, this fact has been recognized from time immemorial that no single one ideal is suitable.
So as you can see, they're just kind of carved in.
After all, within the
It's nothing
Christian tradition, we
too
have
spectacular yet.
two ideals, the way of Martha and the way of Mary.
But
way
the
of
forms are hacked in for the
way of
spiraling
contemplation.
layers of faces.
And
For the
within
first
the Oriental
3 layers.
framework, we have, I think, a rather
3?
more
Is that 3? Yeah, 3.
realistic
Okay.
division
And then
of
we'll probably do a
human
4th around this edge here, and the part of a 5th that will be subtly visible, maybe. I might just dissolve it and taper it out as it gets closer to the outside edge. But we'll see what happens from there. That's it for the moment, though. Thank you for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Medusa's crown.
And that is the way of jnana yoga, the way of contemplation.
Have a good night, Earth.
And these